Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk, Create Training Plans and Content for Your Finance and Operations Project Series, Part 2, the Training Plan. My name is Evan, and I'll be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this web conference through Teams Live Events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. Today's web conference is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation, and by participating in the session using Microsoft Teams, your name, email address, phone number, and/or title may be viewable by other session participants. If you do not consent to being a part of a recorded session, please disconnect at this time. The recording will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for presenters or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions throughout and at the end of the event. If you would like to turn on closed captions during this event, click on the CC button on the lower right side of your screen and use the gear icon to select your preferred language. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Now let's get started. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Rachel Profit, Senior Program Manager, and Dan Ogren, Principal Group Program Manager. Rachel, over to you.
Thanks, Evan. And thanks everyone for joining me today. I'm super excited to continue our series with part 2, where we're really going to dive deep into the training plan. For those of you who don't know me, again, my name is Rachel Profit. I am a senior fast track solution architect based out of Denver, Colorado. My contact information is here on the screen, and I do invite you to follow me on Twitter or connect with me on LinkedIn, and you can follow my blog at dynamics365lady.com. In today's session, we're really going to dive deep, like I said, into the training plan. So we're going to be talking about the different components of a training plan and when you should start creating your plan. We're also going to talk about the who, what, when, where, and how users will be trained. And we'll take a look at a sample training plan. I've put together some templates that will be provided for you along with the recording. And we'll also discuss the patterns and anti-patterns for creating your training plan. So with that, let's go ahead and dive right in. Kind of reviewing very quickly where we started off or where we ended off in part 1 is that process of creating that training plan and remembering that it's an iterative process. So we have that 6-step journey where we're going to start by managing the change, making sure that we're involving the user, because the most important part of that user adoption, again, is the users themselves. Building that foundation, prototyping, mock-ups, getting those first rough drafts put together, and then putting together your communication plan. Once you've done that, you can start developing those training materials and marketing that out to your user base and building and distributing that content. When we think about that iterative process, we start off by identifying those learning goals, and then we start creating those domains and the actual learning plan itself, and identifying what type of content and what type of delivery will be appropriate for our audience, the type of content that we're teaching them. And then once we've identified and done all of our homework up front, then we can start actually creating that content. But we can't forget that it's super critical and important to evaluate your success before you kind of start tweaking and editing that plan. So diving into some more details about this, I'm going to talk about the who, what, when, and where. So starting out with the who. When we think about who will be trained, there's a couple different pieces of information that you're going to need to gather. You're going to need to make sure that you're covering all of the licensed users for your application, whether that's just finance and operations, if that includes some customer engagement components or human resources applications, if you've built some Power Apps or some Power Automates that users are going to use as a part of their business processes, you'll want to include those as well. If you're also implementing some third-party ISV solutions that sit outside of the system and they're not going to be logging into finance and operations directly, for example, you'll want to make sure that they're included as well. When you're gathering the information about the who, you'll want to also make sure that you're gathering information about where they are located. So when you start taking that inventory, make sure that you have a spreadsheet or some mechanism where you can track, the person's name, what their location is, what type of device they use as well. So some of your users may be using a laptop that they can actually bring to the training. Other users, for example, may have a desktop, and they're obviously not going to pick up their desktop and bring that to the training. You might have users that are working from home, and with the COVID situation, everyone might be working from home. You might also have users out in your warehouse that are using very specific devices to the machinery or the equipment that they are working with. So making sure that you catalog those different types of devices in your inventory will be critical as well. You'll also want to think about what is their job role or their job title. Sometimes job titles aren't very representative of how they use the system, but both of those pieces of information might still be useful or meaningful in your plan. What's more meaningful oftentimes when you're putting the training plan together is the persona or the role that they play in the system. Although you might have 3 or 4 different people that all have slightly different job titles, they might all be doing the same role or the same function in the system. So trying to group those users by those personas of how they use the system will be most effective and helpful. You'll also want to think about how they connect to the system. Do they connect to the system directly, or do they have to connect, through a VPN first, or do they use their cell phone to connect? And thinking about the different nuances of, who those people are and how they use the system. When you're collecting that information, you're going to want to group like users together, so those personas and those devices, because the way that you train them and the way that you teach them will be different. So next, after you have identified who needs to be trained, you'll need to start thinking about what they're going to need to be trained on. So when we're starting to collect the information and gather those requirements, you're going to want a detailed list of those business processes. That list of business processes should map to the same list of business processes that are part of your requirements in either your business process modeler or in your Azure DevOps project. When you're collecting this information, we don't just want business processes to be identified. We also want to identify business process changes. Things that have changed significantly are going to need more attention in your training plan. So if you're using Azure DevOps, you might consider using a tag on those business process or adding a custom field into your Azure DevOps to indicate that this is a business process change from the way it's done today in your current system or your current environment. You'll also want to consider if you've got standard operating procedures that exist for the current processes, and if you can gather those. There might be documentation and step-by-steps and things, artifacts that already exist for the current process that might be useful inputs into your training. So when you're gathering all of that what information, ask the users, ask the managers, figure out where that documentation might exist today, because that documentation will oftentimes help speed up the process. It can also be useful to your partner and the consulting organization to figure out what the business requirements are and what you're doing in your current system. When you're thinking about how to organize this information, again, the key here is to make sure you're gathering that and organizing it alongside the actual business requirements. And then making business process flows that include your swim lanes will also be useful for you to help identify the different roles and the different people or personas that need to be identified. If you do capture those like Visio diagrams with swim lanes on them, you can use those documents again as an input into the training plan and even into the content itself to help explain the process to your users. Now that you've figured out the what we need to be trained on. The next step is to figure out when they'll need to be trained. So you'll need to figure out that timing relative to the go live. So when you look at the what list, you're going to need to identify, how much training exactly is this? Is this an hour's worth of training? Is this a day's worth of training? Can my users be taken out of their job for the entire day? Or do I need to, break this up over multiple days so that they can still do their day-to-day work? So when you're first starting to put the plan together, this will likely be an estimate. And as you get further along in the design process and the planning process, you're going to go back and edit these details, but you're going to want to take a stab, a first draft at how long is each one of these training classes or e-learning courses that we need to convey to the user, and use that as a gut. Like if someone is going to be using the software 8 hours a day and they have 40 different tasks that they need to complete in the software, and you've only scheduled 1 hour of training, that's not likely sufficient. And so you'll also want to think about when you kind of compare back to your who as well. Let's say you're implementing advanced warehouse management out in your warehouse. You likely can't train all of them at the same exact time. So you'll need to consider, I'm going to need to deliver this course maybe 2 or 3 times so I can just take out a few people from the warehouse at a time. But maybe depending on your warehouse, maybe you can take everyone out of the warehouse and shut the warehouse down for 4 hours while you do this training. But those are the types of logistics that you'll need to think about when putting your plan together, because if you need to deliver a particular course 2 or 3 times, that's going to take longer in the plan. If you're going to shut your warehouse down for 4 hours or an entire day or whatever it might be, or you're going to ask your users to come in or stay late or work outside of their normal working hours, you're going to need a clear communication plan and some incentives to get your workers to stay for these additional hours. So when you're thinking about how to organize all of this information, you're going to want to think of each training format that you want. And I typically like to work backwards from the go live, using that just-in-time training approach, which we talked a little bit about in part 1. But when we work backwards from the go live, using that just-in-time approach, the closer my training is to when they will actually start using that new technology and that new skill, the better off we're going to be. You're also going to need to think about the location. If you have 15 different warehouses and they're spread all over the United States, you need to consider, well, I'm going to have to also have different trainers for these. Can these classes be running simultaneously, or do I only have 6 trainers and they're going to have to, start at warehouse 1 and then they'll go to warehouse 2? And how far apart are they? So you'll need to think about that location where this training is going to happen so that you can organize all the logistics of getting trainers and participants to where they need to be, when they need to be. So when we start thinking about the where the training will be performed, this is just as important. So you'll want to take an inventory of the rooms that you have available for any instructor-led courses that you're going to be hosting. So if you're going to be doing some live training classes, you need a physical room that will hold enough people to do this. And because we're teaching on technology, you need to consider, does this room have appropriate internet capabilities? Can I put enough computers in there? Do I have enough devices? Do I need printers in this room so we can practice the printing label process? If you're going to be doing virtual training, you'll need to consider the virtual conference tool capabilities. How many people can I put into my Teams meeting or my Zoom meeting? And do I need extra moderators or facilitators to help answer questions if you're going to have a really large classroom? When I'm thinking about training, you want to very carefully consider the ratio of instructors to students. If you put one instructor in a room with 300 people, the amount of attention that each participant is going to get is going to be very minimal. And if you think about your, college courses that were very lecture style, think about how much you took out of those classes versus a smaller class size where each person is able to get that individualized attention. Now, maybe you don't have the luxury of breaking those down into groups of 10 to 15, which is about where I say is the limit of what one instructor can handle to give that personalized attention that's needed, especially during hands-on exercises. Then you'll want to consider bringing in additional moderators or SMEs or managers to help assist during that classroom so that they can go around and check on each of the users and make sure that they're able to successfully do those exercises. From an equipment and device standpoint as well, you'll need to remember if we collected in our WHO that people have desktops, we're going to need to have a computer for them in in the space. So we're going to have to coordinate with IT to make sure we get those loaner laptops or loaner computers, but also consider if there's a difference between the type of device that will be in the training room versus what the user uses on a normal basis. I've seen this before where I'll take the accounting department as an example, and they're normally used to using a desktop computer with a keyboard and a mouse, but during training they were given laptops, and it's not the same comfort zone that those accounting people kind of have in their day-to-day. And so the feel of the keyboard, not having a mouse and having to use a touchpad was very different than what they were used to. And we actually lost a lot of time to kind of getting the users comfortable with a different type of device that they're not used to. So you'll want to consider that in your equipment and device requirements and whether or not it makes sense to use a different type of device than the user uses in their day-to-day training or their day-to-day system use. So when you're collecting this, think about each training format. Another consideration, if you're going to be building self-paced learning content, consider, does the user or the consumer of that content have a way to watch that content? For example, if you're going to do some self-paced training courses for your warehouse staff, they probably don't have computers that they use on a regular basis. So you may need to set up a computer lab at the warehouse that has a handful of computers and staff someone there to help support those users with logging into those computers and starting those training courses. If you're expecting people to use their own personal cell phone or devices to take training, make sure that you're considering that as well and communicating those expectations out to your users. So next, you're going to need to determine who is going to conduct this training. So a lot of times organizations will take on a train the trainer approach. And I've seen this happen in a lot of cases where the trainers are the business process SMEs or the business process owners that are a part of the project. And that's not necessarily a terrible idea because they probably have the most experience with the software. But you'll need to ask yourself, what experience do those users have with training? Because just because they're great at the business process or they understand the business really well doesn't necessarily make them a great trainer. So you'll need to consider what their presentation skills are, and maybe that person would be better suited towards writing content or being a facilitator in the classroom rather than the person standing up in front of the classroom. You'll also need to think about what tools those trainers will need to use to conduct the training. So, do I need to train my trainers on how to use these, specific devices that will be used as a part of the training? Do I need to train them on how to use a Teams meeting or, whatever tool you might be using to do virtual training? Because those factors and those considerations will need to be included in your plan. If most of your trainers don't have experience with the tools that you'll be using, you're going to need to train them how to use the tools, and that takes time and effort as well. You'll also need to consider how much time each trainer will be away from their regular work if you're using your business users as your trainers. If you're going to be outsourcing trainers and bringing trainers in from your partner or from another organization to help deliver and facilitate that training, obviously this is less of a factor for those trainers, but you'll still probably, if you're using an external trainer like a consultant from your partner or a third party that is, focused on training, you're still probably going to want your business process owners to be present in those training classes as facilitators. So again, you're going to want to organize by the training formats, the locations where the training is happening, because if your trainers need to move from facility to facility, you'll need to account for that in your plan and in your communication with your trainers. You'll also need to consider all of the devices and equipment and software that you're using to conduct that training. So when we think about when to create the plan, you're going to want to make sure that you're collecting all of this information that we've talked about, and you're going to want to start early. If you wait until UAT is done and your project plan has 5 days allocated to it after the end of UAT to put your training plan together, you're probably going to be woefully unsuccessful in putting together a comprehensive training plan. So we recommend that you start the process of putting your training plan together early alongside the gathering of the requirements, which is usually one of those first steps that's happening. Now, you probably don't want to start developing content until later in the project, but there might be parts or portions of content that you can start drafting and getting, rough wireframes or storyboards put together. Make sure that you're updating it often. It is iterative, and as you learn more things about your project and the requirements and the system, you're going to want to keep updating that plan. And use a tool, whether that's Excel or Azure DevOps, or you can use Word documents, you can use project plans. If you don't have a sophisticated learning management system or content management system, that's okay. Learning management systems and content management systems are great tools, but they can oftentimes cost a lot of money and take time and effort to implement. And if you don't already have one in place, that can actually slow down the process of putting this together. So if you don't have a fancy LMS or CMS, then look to use some basic tools. And the samples that I'm going to be providing are Word and Excel-based examples. So one of the documents that you'll want to put together, and it doesn't, again, really matter if you're documenting this in a Word document or you could use Azure DevOps to document all this information, but you're going to want to put a charter together. And this charter is going to describe the details about what your training approach is. So this document is going to identify some key terms, the training assumptions that you're making in order to start training these users, the timing, the logistics. You've probably gone through and decided, well, we're going to start training the users 2 weeks prior to go live. Some of those basics, you're going to want to document those things. And as the plan kind of evolves, you're going to want to update this document. It's likely that you'll have a lot of different people contributing to the content and to the delivery of your training plan. And so making sure that they're on board and they understand this plan is important. I oftentimes suggest that you work with your managers as well as your human resources department to kind of put this plan together and working towards that communication plan with your users. So once you've got a training plan charter, and I do have a sample that I'll share with you, and I'll do a quick demo of it, you can start making a sample training plan. Now, when you first start, you might keep it very basic and just have some topics listed out with a delivery approach, a duration, how long it's going to be, along with some learning objectives. And then for your development action items, you might kind of document like the what, the who, and the when. This is a very basic plan, and it's a good starting point, but as you kind of get further along in your project, you're likely to need a lot more detail. And so that's where the detailed sample training plan comes in. Instead of spending a bunch of time with some screenshots here, what I'm going to do is switch over. But at a very high level, the different components that we talked about, each one has its own tab. And then the plan itself is where I'm kind of pulling all of that information together and then creating a course registration. And so that's when where I can keep track of my attendance of, okay, these are the people who are registered for these courses. These are the people who attended. Did they take their survey? Did they pass their quiz? So on and so forth. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and switch over to this spreadsheet sample, which we will be providing for you, and just kind of walk through at a high level how to use this. So this first tab is really focused on the users. So we're tracking the details of those user names, what office location they're at. We've got a drop-down box here where you can indicate what type of device they have. You might need to customize these lists. So if there's different types of tablets that are being used or different types of scan guns in your warehouses, you might want to document that. The department and job title and that kind of system role or persona of that user. If you're gathering all of this information, these are great inputs into putting your actual security plan together so that you can start developing the security. The rest of the columns that I've put in here are licenses to indicate which systems they'll be using. Obviously, if you have additional systems, you can add more columns, but we're indicating what type of licenses they have. So if they are using Dynamics 365 Finance, Supply Chain, Human Resources, Commerce, if they have activity teams, HR teams, or device queues. And this can also be a great input for you to validate that you have all the right licensing in place for your users. The next tab is where I can detail out my courses. So this is where you're kind of going to outline each of the courses that you have. You can see here in my sample that I have numbered my courses. You might have your own numbering technique, but it's important because you're going to have a lot of courses that you have some sort of unique identifier. You might have some courses that have very similar names or descriptions. So using course numbers will help you map back that content and all the artifacts that go with the particular course to the right particular course. So, giving your courses a name and then breaking down the module or topic that it's related to, along with the product that it's related to. We'll talk more about making objectives in the content development part 3, which is happening next Tuesday. But this is where you're going to want to estimate the length of that course and specify the format that you're going to be using, and then document any hardware requirements. And then you can see I've got several columns out here that are really for the who's in charge of this. So you're going to want to assign at least a business SME, a content owner, a content developer, and a content reviewer. You don't want to put the same name in all 4 columns. So your business SME and content owner might be the same. And you definitely at a very bare minimum need to make sure that someone else reviews the content other than the person who develops the content. The content developer is oftentimes like the owner might be delegating this task out to other people in their department to work on that content. So you might have multiple content developers, but the person who's in charge of it and making sure that the finished product is acceptable for the business is that content owner. And you might have multiple business SMEs as well that can contribute to that content. The next tab is our locations. So this is like where my training is going to happen. So this is where I can identify, all the different rooms or tools or devices that will be used. So Teams meetings or live broadcasts, what your capacity is, if you have wireless capacity and wired capacity, what office this is located in, does it already have a projector, a flip chart, a whiteboard? If you're using like a Teams meeting, you might be using the whiteboard feature inside of Teams. So kind of figuring out those logistics of the additional equipment that's needed. If you have conference rooms that you're going to be using, but maybe they don't have a whiteboard or a flip chart to use as a parking lot or to illustrate examples, you might need to bring those different types of equipment into the rooms. The next tab is where we can keep track of the actual trainers. So who are those specific trainers? What topics are they able to train on? What's their training experience? What tools do they have experience with? What department are they in? And what's their estimated training time that they'll be away? So that way you can identify, am I overutilizing one resource and need to kind of rebalance this out across different people? The plan is really the meat of this, and this is where you pull it all together. Some of these columns, like course name, for example, anything that's highlighted yellow means that there's a VLOOKUP formula in here. So once you put a course number in here, the system will automatically pull in the course name and the length for you. The green columns are the columns where you're going to pick a drop-down box and choose the right option, which came from another tab. And then you can also specify additional information here. Don't take this as a be-all end-all template. This is a really excellent starting point, and you might need to tweak this or add additional things depending on your business, and maybe you have multiple SMEs, but use it as a guide. The last tab is the course registration. So once you've got the plan and you start registering people for courses, or they start signing up for courses, this is where you can keep track of everyone that's going to each course. And this can be an input into your communication plan to teach people exactly or to communicate to people exactly what courses they need to attend, when they need to attend those, and so on. When you're putting the detailed plan together, right, the key inputs here are the delivery date, start time, and end time of those classes. If they're self-paced courses, you may not have a delivery date, but you might instead have a required date, like they have to take that self-paced course no later than, next Friday, or whatever that date is. So you could use your delivery date on a self-paced course to indicate the last day that they have to take that particular course. All right, so switching back to our slides. Like I said, I switched over to that demo there for you. What I want to do now is kind of switch gears a little bit to talk about patterns and anti-patterns of putting your training plan together. So in our first scenario, the project plan has minimal time dedicated to training delivery. The details about the content development and training plan development are not included in the project plan. So from an anti-pattern standpoint, this is a definite no-go. You do not want to wait until after UAT to plan the training. You want to make sure that you're allowing sufficient time for putting both the plan together and the content development and the delivery. So all three of these things should be outlined in your project plan. The delivery is oftentimes very close to go live. The content development is probably lining up with the end of your build, so it's probably happening simultaneously throughout your testing phase and going right up until the training delivery. You don't want to be developing content the night before your training class. That's not a good situation. Not for the people developing the content, not for the people receiving that content. Your training plan design should start after the design of your solution is completed. So after you've got all of those requirements in place, you should have all of the basic information that you need to start your plan. But remember, it's iterative, so it's going to be constantly tweaking and changing as the solution comes along. Your content development plan should be completed before the first day of training delivery. And I recommend having a lot of that in place prior to UAT so that your documentation can be considered as a part of your UAT process. In our next scenario, the training is ready to be completed, but security is not tested and in place for end users. All the users have been assigned to the system administrator security role. Again, this is a little bit of a no-go. Do not assign users to elevated security roles for the purposes of training. This will cause confusion for them. It's not giving them a realistic picture of what the solution is going to look like when they start using the system. So you're going to want to make sure that you ensure final security is assigned to those users when you're conducting the training. So it's also important that when you're making screenshots of the solution or you're creating video content and recording demos for your videos, for your training content, you want to make sure that the security is in place. So whoever's recording or taking those screenshots should be logged in with a persona with a security role that matches what the users will see. Because again, if you record a video with system administration access, you're going to see lots of additional tabs and buttons on these screenshots that might be confusing and overwhelming to your users. Each user should be assigned to the security role that they will have in production when that end user training is conducted. And this allows you to get like a good extra final test on all of your security as well before you go live. If you are using elevated security, that's going to, again, cause confusion. In our next scenario, the training content is developed by business process owners and SMEs. The organization is planning to use a train the trainer approach and is planning which business users will conduct the training. So from a pattern standpoint, you want to make sure that you're carefully selecting the trainers to deliver your training. When you're selecting those trainers, or deciding if you're going to use your own business users or use someone external to your organization, you're going to want to consider what are their presentation skills. And maybe their presentation skills aren't up to par, but that might mean that you need to provide some additional training and guidance to those particular business users to help them get up to where they need to be so that they have the proper presentation skills. You want to make sure as well that they have empathy and patience with others. It's never a good learning experience for someone if you get up in front of the classroom or you're in a classroom and your trainer is just kind of cold and distant and it just doesn't have the patience to be able to explain things twice or to explain things in a different way. So you'll want to make sure that the personality of the person that you have is that they're empathetic and they can relate to the users and the position that they are in. You'll also want to make sure that they have attention to detail. When you're training, if you're just kind of breezing through and not going through all the details and skipping things, then we might have done a really great job putting content together, but then if the trainer is skipping portions or missing key facts or key pieces of information, then the end users are going to suffer. You also want to make sure that that person has knowledge of the business process to be trained on. And that's oftentimes why using people from your own organization is a great option. But the anti-pattern here is don't select your supervisors and managers to conduct the training just because of their seniority. Now, you might want to include the managers and supervisors because of their seniority to help keep the classroom under control and to help convey the message and the importance of your training. But just because they're a manager or a supervisor doesn't necessarily mean that they're the best person to deliver that training. They might oftentimes be, but it shouldn't be the only reason that you select them. In our next scenario, the training plan is completed and includes all of the users to be trained, topics and objectives to be trained on, and when those users will be trained. So from a pattern standpoint, we want to make sure that you're planning the training logistics, including locations, tools, equipment, and capacity. If you put a training plan together, but it's missing one of these components, the logistics of your training delivery might suffer. If you don't have the proper equipment or the equipment doesn't match what they're going to use, again, the users might suffer because it doesn't really match what they're going to be doing. The orchestration of getting all of these users into the classroom needs to be part of that plan as well. So making sure that the facility or tools or equipment or devices that are going to be part of the training are in the right facility, in the right room at the right time. You'll also want to consider the capacity of each training room. If you have a room that's really designed for 20 people and you stick 30 people in there, it gets really uncomfortable. I actually did some training for a client a while back, and they didn't really have a room that was large enough, and they were doing the warehouse in phases of 30, and this training room was upstairs in the warehouse. It didn't have any air conditioning. It was the middle of the summer. It was super hot. We crammed 30 people in there and everyone was miserable. The participants were not able to take away from that class, any of those classes, what we really needed them to take away from, because everyone was literally shoulder to shoulder and they were sweating profusely and they were distracted by all of these logistical things rather than being able to focus on what they needed to do. We wound up having to redeliver that training in their lunchroom the following week because so many people complained about it. And that was a delay to their project, and it wasn't a great situation for anyone. Making sure that you've got all the right equipment for your instructor. If you've got a whiteboard but no markers, not super useful tool for your instructor. And making sure you've got the right equipment for your participants is also important. Make sure that you're not forgetting the capacity, equipment, or tools in that training plan. So the next scenario, the training content is developed and a detailed training plan is in place. The organization is planning to communicate the training plan to the user. This is a fantastic scenario. It's really important that part of your plan includes a communication plan. If users don't know when and where they're supposed to show up or what's expected of them when they show up, then you're going to have people that don't show up. You're going to have people that show up and have a bad attitude and maybe don't want to participate or don't understand why they want to participate. And if they're not in the right mindset when it's time to train, they're not likely to take away from the objectives that you set forth for that particular training plan. That communication plan should be developed early, and keeping those objectives of the training communicated out to those users throughout your project is important. When you're communicating to those users, make sure that it includes the objectives and goals for implementing your solution, how each user or department can contribute to the overall success of the project, as well as the overall success of the business. How is this helping the business? And, when the business is helped and the business does better, how does that affect the users? And when you'll need to also document when each one of these communications will be sent and to whom each of those communications will be sent to. On that last tab in our spreadsheet, that's where we can collect a lot of that information and start defining that. You might need some additional columns if you're going to have a lot of communications to indicate, which communications each user should get. Some things not to do. Don't only communicate about the training required for employees. Don't just say you need to show up here at this time. Like if that's all you communicate to them, they're not really sure why they're having to do this training. Like what's the purpose of this? What's the benefit of it? We talked a lot in part 1 about change management and communication and letting the employees be part of it. By polling employees and asking them about how they prefer to be trained and taking their feedback and using that in your plan, that can be helpful as well to making sure that the training is successful. And don't wait until just before training, that week before, the day before, to let them know that this training is going to occur. Another great tip too is if you're going to be including any quizzes or tests or hands-on, type things that are going to be evaluated, make sure your employees know. Some people get very stressed and have anxiety about quizzes and tests, and make sure that they understand why you're doing a quiz or a test or making them do a hands-on, and give them time to prepare for it. For some people, they may ask for that content ahead of time so that they can plan and prepare, because that's just the nature of the, certain types of personalities that, they get test anxiety. But the last thing you want to do is put a pop quiz on people. So in our next scenario, the organization is ready to conduct training and is planning to use the Tier 2 user acceptance testing environment. Um, well, I'm not going to say that using your UAT environment is a bad thing or a wrong thing. You need to carefully plan and consider it. So when you're planning your training environment, you'll need to think about the capacity and tier according to the peak user volume during your training. So we've put out some guidance on the number of users and the volume of transactions that are suggested per tier. You'll also need to consider if UAT is still happening and we've got other testing going on in the UAT environment, is it really appropriate to have all of the users in the same training environment? You'll need to look at your specific business, project plan to determine if these two things are going on at the same time. Is it appropriate to use that particular environment? From an anti-pattern, don't simply use the Tier 2 UAT environment if the volume of expected users exceeds the recommended volume for that tier. So here's the slide that has the full details about selecting that correct tier. That Tier 2 is provided, but this is something that if you're planning early, you'll be able to figure out if you're going to need a higher tier environment and budget for that ahead of time. It also takes time to deploy these environments, so you'll need to include that in your project plan as well. All right, in our next scenario, the training content is developed and includes hands-on labs or users will be following along during demonstrations. It's really important that you define a strategy for the data that's going to be used during your training and hands-on labs. You might need to seed data or duplicate data to support many users doing the same action in the system. So if that's the case, think about possibly using the data expansion tool to help seed or duplicate that data. You'll also need to consider the sequence of training. So if I'm going to do the receiving training first and then the purchase order training second, well, if I had the buyers do their training first, they might have created purchase orders that I can use in the receiving training. If I do it the other way around, I'm going to need purchase orders that already exist in order to allow the warehouse personnel to receive those purchase orders. Again, don't give your users system admin access and have them create transactions that are not part of their expected security or their expected duties as a part of training. It's not a good learning experience. In our next scenario, certain roles or people in the organization are the only user or very minimal users perform the same action, and therefore only a small number of users need to be trained. It's still important, even if there's only one person who does a particular job or a particular role, to define a strategy for training those users where there's only one user. You don't want to exclude them. Make sure it includes sufficient training for all of your users, but you might consider using an external training source for those users where there's only one or two people, and send them to an external training class to get that training that they need. You might also consider using on-the-job training or shadowing with consultants to use to make sure that those single users or specialty roles have the sufficient training. You can also consider making users in specialty roles business process owners in the project to make sure that they're aware of the project design and system configuration and they're involved throughout the whole project. In our next scenario, the training content is developed for all users that are expected for the go live, and a strategy for post go live or new users who join the organization post go live is not documented. So you're going to want to make sure that you're defining a strategy for ongoing training and new hires post go live. While having a plan for your go live is important, it's just as important that you have a plan for all of those business changes that happen after the go live as well. So make sure that you're selecting training formats and content that can be easily repeated, especially in positions that have high attrition. Also, select some champions or content owners for the organization to own updates to each different course or content area, and work with your HR department to define the training that's required for each position in your organization. So when you do hire someone new, we know exactly what training they need to do. And from an anti-pattern standpoint, don't only define a strategy for your go live users. Now, when we think about ongoing training, it's important to think about, some of those aspects, and we talked a little bit about that. So when you're thinking about the new hires, you're going to want to consider the attrition. So how much turnover does each role or course have? And courses with higher turnover will need more attention and better resources. You'll also want to consider the format of that training that you've created. Will you need trainers to constantly retrain these new hires? Maybe a self-paced course would make more sense for some of those topics. You'll also want to think about the volume of new hires or expansion. If you're expecting to put up a new warehouse, and we're going to have a lot of new warehouse workers to train over the next year, make sure that your plan includes something that is appropriate to train that volume. You'll also want to think about that learning path. So you might get transfers from other teams, or maybe you might have someone who's completely brand new to your organization. Consider the other new hire onboarding activities and how your system training will fit into that overall process. And that's typically something that you'll need to work with your HR department on. Another factor that you'll need to think about is continuous updates. So the software is receiving updates on a monthly basis. You might be delaying your updates and taking the minimum amount of updates, but you're still going to need a strategy. And so you're going to need to make sure that part of your strategy includes someone that's analyzing those release notes, and looking at those targeted release schedules and what's new or changed, and decide a cadence. Assign business owners to be responsible for, their areas to review that what's new, and meet regularly. Maybe you set this up as a quarterly meeting with your business owners to decide what else you want to take on and what you want to implement. We also have the feature management feature, where many of the features might come into the system, but you need to enable them. So you'll need to select which features need to be enabled, determine the timing, develop content, and figure out a rollout strategy and training plan. It's going to be much smaller scale likely for those specific features, but you still need to create that plan. And then your rollout strategy, if you have like multiple phases in your project plan, or you're going to take on new features in the future, creating a project plan for each rollout. And although it might not be the same scale as the larger implementation, it's still important to define objectives and goals for each one of those rollouts. So making sure that you're making the project plan, a communication plan, a training plan, a content development plan, and evaluate after each rollout. See, figure out, have that after action review and figure out what can I do better next time. Because again, it's a constant continuous improvement. And my last slide that I really want to talk about on today's session is about 15 ways to build a growth mindset. A growth mindset means that one embraces challenges and persists in the face of setbacks, and they take responsibility for their words and actions and acknowledge that effort is the path towards mastery. It's the practice of, or the reason behind, the saying practice makes perfect. By kind of building a growth mindset in your team and in your project, it will make the process of taking on change management and putting a change management process in place much easier. So, acknowledge and embrace imperfection in yourself and in others. Facing challenges bravely. If you find yourself terrified or scared of a change, stop and reframe the situation in your mind. There's a lot of guidance, and we're running a little bit low on time, and I want to make sure we have enough time for questions, but paying attention to your words and thoughts is another key way. So starting to pay attention to the words that you speak, even the words that you kind of say in your mind make a difference in your own attitude, and try replacing negative thoughts with more positive ones to help build a growth mindset. Stop seeking approval from others. So pretending to be someone you're not disrespects who you really are, and it makes you fake. You know, becoming truly authentic is a process, and it takes a lot of inner work. Cultivating a sense of purpose is the next one. Does your life feel like it's purpose driven? You know, if yes, define for yourself what that purpose encompasses. If you're drawing a blank when you think about what your purpose is, then ask, that your life's purpose become clear to you. Redefine genius. We all have strengths and weaknesses. And I think when you think about a project like this in training, especially, people are going to be good at some things and not great at others. And playing to strengths is always going to make that process easier. Turning criticism around until you find its gift. Is the next one. So the purpose of criticism is to make things better. So it's not to berate you or your process or your content or the project as an overall feed. So that's another great one. Value the process over the end results. And remember, it's the journey that matters, not the destination. Learn from your mistakes and the mistakes of others. When you put your training plan together, it's not going to be perfect. When you put your content together, it's not going to be perfect. But if you can learn from those mistakes and make it better for the next time, then you've got that growth mindset. Taking in risks in the company of others. Try not to make yourself to take yourself too seriously. Be willing to make mistakes in front of others, because if you're growing, then it's easier for others to see that and grow from you. And also being realistic. Sometimes, lots of times, to learn a new skill, like learning a new language or learning to play a new instrument or learning a new piece of software, it takes longer than you might think it does. And keeping and making sure your goals are realistic is important. And speed is not important. When you have a growth mindset, you might have some people in your organization that it's going to take them longer to learn the new concept. And so, we don't have to do this really, really fast. And owning your own attitude is the last one. If you have a growth mindset, take the time and effort to develop it. Persist, and opportunities will come. And if we take all of these and kind of put them into yourself and into your team throughout your project and into your training plan, you'll find that you're going to be more successful. So with that, we'll open it up for questions. I do invite you to make sure that you come to part 3. We do have a couple of questions in here. So, so someone had asked, define system role. So I think when I was talking about system role, I'm talking about the role that they do in the system. You could be very specific to the actual security role that they're using in the system. Or it could be a little bit more generic, and it might start out more generic at the beginning of your plan, but as you get closer to go live, it's likely to be a little bit more specific. We also had a question come in. Where can we find more information about setting up consumable data for end users to consume during their training? I don't have a link handy for that. I don't know, Dan, did you answer that and give a link for the data expansion tool?
No, I didn't.
Okay, so the data expansion tool is the tool that we have available with finance and operations. I know that we do have some links. I'll make sure that that gets posted in with the final presentation in the slides, because I don't have it handy. But a quick Google or Bing search for data expansion tool Dynamics 365 will likely find you a result, but I'll find a link and make sure it's added to the slide. Great question. Did we have any other questions that we needed to address? Okay, we got another one came in. Can the training plan charter that was shown in Excel format easily be linked to Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations Learning Module or Talent, Human Resources. I saw, for instance, locations, courses, trainers. This information is already available in the database, so it would be a pity to have it copied and pasted manually, and it would be nice that updates made in Excel can be published in D365. That's a great question. The template that I put together was independent of that, but it would be just as easy because there are data entities for all of those that you could make an Excel template that actually links to those entities in your environment. The sample that I provided, isn't connected that way, but that might be something that I can work on and try to publish that in the future. So it's a great idea. And you're absolutely right. If you are using the human resources module, a lot of that can be tracked directly in the learning module. We also had another question come in. Where can we find your training planner Excel file? It will be available on the same site when the recording is available. So within 5 days is when that recording is typically available and up on the site, and you'll get a link to that recording in your email once it is available. And the Word document and the Excel template that I showed today will be available alongside with the PowerPoints as well. So I think that wraps up all the questions that we had in the queue. I really appreciate everyone joining us today, and I hope to see you on part 3 next Tuesday. With that, I'm going to hand it back over to Evan to wrap us up today.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. We would like to get your feedback on today's session. I have posted a link to a short survey in the Q&A panel. We value your feedback and welcome your input on how we did today and what you would like to see in future sessions. The survey scores on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible, and we thank you for your participation in that. As a reminder, the recording for today's session will be available on the TechTalks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenters, and a thank you to our audience for logging in and joining us today. Please stay safe and have a great rest of your day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.